Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to DASC. So, some really exciting news. So, DASC is partnered with Student Council, with Disability Inclusion Agency, Natural Science Council, Liberal Arts Council, the Senate of College Councils, and we have actually put out a survey to get feedback for the creation of a Disability Cultural Center at UT Austin. So, do take the survey. It's like amazing data that we would need to really get support to tell UT why a Disability Culture Center would be needed. So, I'd love it for you guys to take the survey. It's super short and it's really important. Next slide. Now, today we are joined by Dr. Alison Kafer. Dr. Allison Keifer is an associate professor of the feminist studies at UT Austin. She's the author of the Feminist Queer Crip, and she had Feminist Queer Crip, and she has appeared in numerous journals and anthologies, including Disability Studies Quarterly, Feminist Disability Studies, Journal of Library and Cultural Disability Studies, Sex and Disability, and South Atlantic Quarterly. Yeah, she's an amazing person. But yes. Now, today we're going to talk about ableism. I don't know if anyone of y'all have known, but when I first came to DASC, I honestly have never heard of the word ableism before. And it wasn't until I came to DASC that I realized, wow, this is what ableism is. So what is ableism? Now, ableism is discrimination against disabled people in favor of able-bodied people. Now, at its heart, ableism is rooted in the assumption that disabled people require fixing and defines people by their disability. Like racism and sexism, ableism classifies an entire group of people as less than and includes harmful stereotypes, misconceptions, and generalizations of people with disabilities. And it's sad to say this, but very true. The world was built with wasn't built for people with disabilities in mind. And because of this, the world we live in is inherently ableist. Cool. Oh, cool. I think you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, my apologies. Okay, so ableism can take many different forms. So what does it look like? We see here that in policy, it can be from the lack of compliance with disability rights laws like the ADA. We can see that in the segregation of students with disabilities into separate schools, for instance, gen ed versus special ed, but also that can go along perhaps racial lines with including students of color predominantly in the special ed environment. We also see that there can be the use of restraint or seclusion as a means of being able to control students with disabilities. Then we also have segregating adults and children with disabilities in institutions sometimes when, well, can be an option that is viable for disabled people. We also see that more like a lot of instances that institutionalization of disabled people can be quite harmful. Then also we see the failing to incorporate accessibility into building design plans, so more so physical accessibility, a lack of braille in buildings, inaccessible websites, and then we see like the assumption that people with disabilities want to, or need to be fixed. And actually a point that I kind of want to bring up is that in my social construction and disabilities classes, that kind of aligns with like this idea, is the idea of curative time and curative violence, where an ableist society is always looking to promote cure among disabled people, or that we're always looking to be cured or fixed. And that can also lead to different medical or physical trauma related to this need or want to be cured, if you will. And then of course we see using disability as a punchline or mock people with disabilities, so forth with stereotyping, and then refusing to provide reasonable accommodations. And then at its worst, ableism can take the form of genocide, such as the eugenics movement over the early 1990s, and of course, the mass murder of disabled people within Nazi Germany, for instance. And then, of course, we have other forms of ableism. Of course, this picture here is I forget what you call this, like a poster, if you will, for the relatively new movie that has come out called Music, which is like a very harmful depiction of a nonverbal autistic child. So what's here. So then in terms of other forms of ableism, we see choosing accessible venues for a meeting or event that therefore excludes disabled participants, using someone else's mobility device as a hand or foot rest, or just taking or abusing one's mobility device. Then we see the framing of disability as either being tragic or inspirational within the media. And then, of course, we see within predominantly the acting world the use of casting non-disabled actors to play disabled characters and play movie, TV show, etc., wherein disabled actors usually don't have as many opportunities, sometimes because of their disabilities. So then, of course, there's the push and want to have more accurate representation of disabled actors. And then we have making movies that don't have audio or descriptions or closed captioning, the using of an accessible bathroom stall when you have the option to use the other ones, then wearing scented products in a scent-free environment, then, of course, talking the infantilization of people, of disabled people, and talking to them as if they are a child, or talking about them instead of directly to them. And that can also go for deaf people or people who use sign language with not actually directly communicating with them. And then asking invasive questions regarding medical history, and then assuming people that have to have a visible disability to actually be disabled. And that, of course, can incredibly stigmatize those who have invisible disabilities, such as mental illnesses or intellectual disabilities, so on and so forth. And then we have questioning if somebody's actually disabled, and asking, how did you become disabled? I'm sorry for speaking very quickly, my apologies. And then we also have the tendency for ableist microaggressions to be used in certain environments. And of course, I am not going to read out all of them because some of them are very inflammatory. So the instances of "that's so lame," or using certain medical terms that have been used in the past to describe certain intellectual development issues, and then, like, for instance, "that guy's crazy," and kind of making fun of mental illnesses, so on and so forth. References to OCD, or using references regarding blindness or deafness, so on and so forth. And then, of course, we have the "I don't even think of you as disabled," which I can assure you that disabled people do not like to hear at all. So, and then, of course, many people don't mean to be insulting with these, and they oftentimes have good intentions, but even well-meant comments and actions can have a serious toll on disabled people.
So what can we do to like fight this ableism? Well, for one thing, believe people when they say that they are disabled. Like, don't perceive that they are faking their disability. Listen to people when they are requesting accommodations. Don't assume you know what someone needs. Never touch a person with a disability or their mobility equipment without their permission. Keep invasive questions to yourself. Don't speak on behalf of someone with a disability unless they specifically ask you to. And talk about disability with children and young people, and incorporate accessibility in your event planning. Now, here's just like, instead of saying these, using different language and these ableist languages that, they may seem very normal and like, oh, they're using everyday language, but they're actually quite harmful, or they can really show your biases. So instead of saying, like crazy or insane, maybe say unreal, unbelievable, jerk, awful, bad, moody, it's just an alternative and way more of an inclusive way to say things. Now, this is just a source, which I thought was really useful. that shows like a whole guide of what you could say instead of this. So I'll put that link, I'll share this link with you guys later. But yes, so that is our short introduction of ableism. So ableism has so much facets and there's just so much to go into it. Now we're gonna we're gonna have a discussion with Dr. Allison Kafer. And for let me see. Our first question to Dr. Kafer. So, how does ableism impact our everyday lives?
That was a great presentation. Y'all did an excellent job of defining it, but also of like giving concrete examples of how it happens. I don't know that I've seen it described in quite that way, and then with tips. So that was wonderful. I hope I'm not the only one answering these questions. Are we all going to answer them together?
I mean, I can certainly put in my 2 cents about some of these for sure. But
Okay, good. So, Niley, what was the question again?
Oh, how does ableism affect our everyday lives?
Oh, well, I think you all just gave a bunch of great examples. I think sometimes it's helpful to think not only about the way ableism affects disabled people, but also to think about the way it affects all people. And so I think the university is a great example of that. And so all of the ways that we are surveilled and evaluated and managed and controlled, many of those are disability related or ability related terms, right? You have to be coherent and you have to be prompt and you have to be professional and you have to be legible and you have to be logical and you have to be on time and you have to make deadlines. And these are all ways of deciding who is and isn't disabled in some way, right? In some way they're about deciding who has the capacity to be here. So I'm also a little uncomfortable with leading off in that way because I don't want to make it seem like, I don't want to do that thing of we're all disabled. And ableism affects everybody, because there are certainly specific and really violent and dangerous ways it affects disabled people. But I also think that those terms get used against a whole bunch of people as a way of keeping them out of specific spaces. So really, I mean, you had a list there at the end of your presentation, right? Of here are terms not to use and here are alternative terms to use. I think you could also make a list of all the things that we are supposed to aspire to be as students or as teachers or as really just as people. And a lot of those are actually also about proving that you're not disabled, right? You're supposed to be smart. You're supposed to be articulate. You're supposed to be behaved. You're supposed to be controlled. Those are all things that are about disability, right? I don't know. What do y'all think?
no, I really like the points you brought up, and it's actually I'm going to bring up something that I watched just yesterday in my social construction disability class, which I really enjoy, which is taught by Dr. Nick Wingisianis, who some of you guys might be familiar with. She actually had a quick conversation with a disability activist named Lydia Exley Brown, who uses they, them pronouns. And they were talking about how, especially within the pandemic, they brought up like this construct of like anti-capitalist construct of how, you know, disability is so founded upon this idea of production, and how, especially in the pandemic, it's kind of exacerbated about like what can we produce, or like how we have to stay in like this kind of normative function of being able to produce something. And especially when you're considering the higher education, you know, university environment of going online and like still being expected to do all this work, even though like, of course, we're living in completely different and sometimes really difficult circumstances, you know. I think it kind of opens up how we would define or how we perceive disability, and kind of hopefully getting better grasp of like the need for accommodations and the need for, you know, timing and stuff like that along those lines.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fact that we can meet like this, right, is something that people didn't used to think was possible. So that would be another example of that kind of rethinking.
I like the point that you made that, you know, to be successful in society, you kind of have to hide your disability, or just like even like, oh, you have to be smart, you have to act a certain way, even you have to articulate your voice a certain way, then they perceive you as better then. And that was, I think that never hit me, but I saw something when they call someone successful, they're like, oh, what an upstanding man or what upstanding woman or whatever they are, right? Upstanding, even the word upstanding is like, oh, so are people who can't walk not successful? I know this. I was like, wait. It astonished me. I was like, huh.
Yeah, or like all the activist campaigns that are about stand up for this or stand up for that, stand up for justice or stand up for liberation or stand up for this person's rights. I mean, that is also this kind of assumption that there's this assumption that to be an advocate or to care passionately about something requires verticality, which really doesn't make any sense if you break it down like that. But that is the way we think about it, that to be assertive or powerful or to demonstrate that you believe in something, you actually are in some ways expected to hold your body in a very particular way. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. To go off of that, what are some intersectionalities between ableism and racism? Because I feel like there are a lot.
Yeah, there are a lot. I mean, you had some in your presentation. So there have been studies that want to show how classrooms are very segregated racially, in part through special ed segregation, so that racial segregation in the classroom happens by the diagnoses that some people are given and not given. And so you're using disability categories as a way to enact racial segregation in the classroom. But also ideas about comportment. I mean, there certainly have been lots of folks talking about how Black and brown folks who have autism or who have speech differences or have other kinds of things are much more likely to be targeted by the police because of this combined ableism and racism that marks particular bodies as dangerous. And that's partly about bodies not moving in a normative way. And that's partly also about white supremacy, assuming that any brown or Black body is out of place. And then also, I mean, I don't know if this is true for y'all as students, but I know that I've talked to faculty who have disabilities, and faculty of color talk about how it's much harder to be out as disabled because there's already this presumption that they aren't good enough, right? And they aren't doing enough work. And so to then identify as needing help, right, in the way that accommodations get framed in an ableist society can be a way of, again, marking insufficiency or incapacity, so that ableism and racism multiply each other in these various ways.
Mm-hmm. That definitely makes sense. Do you think it also correlates with like ableism, with intersectionality, with misogyny as well?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, disability, if we think about disability as about needing help, right, and not being able to do things for oneself and being dependent, those are all also attributes of femininity in a misogynist culture. And so that might make people who are already feminine or feminized reluctant to identify as disabled, but it also might mean that masculine people aren't recognized as having disabilities, or are one of the ways ableism might manifest would be to feminize people who identify or want to be seen as masculine, right? So there's all kinds of ways that these different, in order to further one kind of oppression, you pull on language from another oppression, right? But you all are living all these things in your lives. You surely have examples of how these things are affecting you too.
No, actually, I